introduction, and it's so nice to virtually interact with all of you in Europe and other places in the world, as well as I guess future YouTube viewers. In this talk, I will put forth a provocative view, and I'll also tell the story of how I went from being a skeptic to being a believer about the linguistic nature of emoji. But first, a brief retrospective. I'm a professor of information science now, but I started my career as a linguist. And one of the areas I researched years ago was word order typology. I did a study on information structure and word order type, on focus position in subject, object, verb languages like Japanese and Korean and Tamil, which was the language that I was specializing in, syntacticization of post-verbal position in Tamil, and so forth. So I had these interests many years ago. Around the same time, I also regularly taught a course called Functional Typological Syntax, for which I used Talmy Gavon's 2-volume series by that same name. And I was very influenced by Gavon's views, particularly the notion of syntacticization of discourse patterns. He says, for example, discourse pragmatics plays a decisive role in explaining the syntax of human language, but also in the process of syntacticization, via which a more transparent iconic mode of communication, the pragmatic mode, gives rise eventually to the more abstract, obviously iconic syntactic mode. He says this is a pervasive fact of language change, language ontogeny, and language evolution. Now, fast forward several decades, and in recent years, I've been researching graphicons, which are graphical icons such as emoticons, emoji, and stickers, and most recently Animoji, which I guess you can't see the video here. I had a little video that are used in computer-mediated discourse, and they've sort of evolved in this order, becoming increasingly colorful, increasingly large, increasingly dynamic, and in the case of Animoji, they have speech as well. But in this talk, we're going to focus on emoji, and they can be understood in relation to their antecedents, ASCII emoticons, as well as in relation to what followed, which is stickers. So compared to ASCII emoticons, emoji are viewed straight on rather than rotated 90 degrees. They're colorful, their images are more complex, and the types include animals, objects, activities, symbols, and flags, in addition to faces. They're provided by the platforms rather than user-generated, which is another sort of interesting finding, and so forth. In comparison with stickers, emoji are smaller and less complex. They're more static, and they don't typically include text. But these characteristics may actually be an advantage because, unlike stickers, they can appear in line with textual utterances, and they can also appear in sequences. So these, I would say there's 3 characteristics then that are going to be particularly important for my talk today. First of all, that emoji offer a variety of different types of content, that they can appear together with textual utterances, and that they can appear in sequences. Oh, and I had all these lovely pictures of emoji that didn't render there, sorry. So quite a lot of people have speculated that emoji are a language or are becoming a language. So for example, emojis have become a universal language that is used across apps, across platforms, and across cultures, said A et al. In 2017. Or Viv Evans is quoted as saying, emoji is the fastest growing form of language in history based on its incredible adoption rate and speed of evolution. And in the Net Sanity Parents Guide to the Language of Emoji, they write, the emoji language is nothing new. And even 2 years ago, news outlets were reporting on how children and teens use emoji to communicate in a secret language. Often referred to as modern-day hieroglyphics, emojis have grown from a convenient way to indicate sarcasm or a joke into a nearly complete mode of communication. But as many enthusiasts as there are for emoji language, there are as many or more skeptics, both linguists and in the more popular press. The website Lexico, for example, says you probably can't use emojis by themselves as a self-contained way of communicating with people without sooner or later needing to resort to English or another language, or alternatively choosing to keep your communication very restricted in its content. This is why most linguists wouldn't say that emojis constitute a language in the strict sense. Linguists Derscheid and Seaver in 2017, emoji cannot become a language as it is not possible to convey complex matters using only emojis. While it is conceivable that one might use emojis to communicate with people whose language one does not speak, for example, in the first encounter with refugees, such communication will always be restricted to the exchange of rudimentary information. Also, other linguists comment, Cohn says emoji lack the flexibility needed to create a new language. And Gown and McCulloch last year believe that typical uses of emoji are more similar to gesture than to language. Now, until very recently, I counted myself among these number of skeptics. I did not think that emoji would ever become or could become a true language like verbal language. So I think it's important to consider the arguments for that position. First from Derscheid and Seaver, they claim that, they point out that there's a lack of equivalence between sequences of letters and those of emojis, and thus sequences consisting exclusively of emojis lack possibilities of expression that are inherent to alphabetical writing. They're not alphabetical. Important information needed to construct a sentence, such as tense, mode, and case, cannot be represented through emojis, they say. And the interpretation sequences becomes more difficult the more complex a message is. I am absolutely agreeing with that last point. Cohn argues that since grammar requires grouping and hierarchy, emoji are not a language because they don't allow building of units from parts. Instead, emoji convey information in a linear unit string, which limits how complex expressions can be made. Moreover, he states that linear order follows the agent-action pattern, so agent first followed by action, and he claims that this is a cognitively based pattern rather than evidence of grammar. We'll come back to this idea later on. It's an important one. He doubts that emoji would be able to create embedded clauses, and he points out that users can't create novel signs, which is a requisite for all languages, especially emerging languages. And last, Gown and McCulloch reproduce a table from David McNeil laying out some differences between gesture, co-speech gesture, and properties of language proper. And they conclude that for all of these parameters, typical uses of emoji are more similar to the properties of gesture than to those of language. That is to say, they see emoji as being global and synthetic rather than hierarchical and analytic, non-combinatoric, context-sensitive, and lacking standards of form or grammatical judgments. We'll come back to all of these points. Meanwhile, let's consider the evidence, because a lot has happened in the world of emoji and emoji research since these studies were done, even though they were just done within the last few years. First of all, technically, emoji are text. As Pohl et al. Point out, what makes emoji special as a means of adding visuals to text is that they are text. Instead of sending images of smileys or airplanes, characters representing them are transmitted. In other words, they form a logographic writing system. Hence, they can be used in places such as URLs, email subjects, or user names. So this would seem to contradict Scheid and Siever's claim that there's no equivalence between sequences of letters and those of emojis. Emojis can actually substitute for letters. Moreover, emoji have many language-like properties. Here's a bunch of examples from English. So first, emoji can substitute for letters, as we were just saying, for words, for phrases, and full utterances, and also for parts of words. As we can see in this example here, the hardest part, the diamond represents the concept of hard in the word hardest, and the artist palette is used to represent the sound of art in the word part. Emoji can be repeated to indicate, for example, plurality, as in babies, and adverbial modification, as in repeated airplanes that are used to mean fly quickly. Sequences of emoji, the main focus of our talk today, combine in sentences with subject, object, and verb. For example, I love pizza, said by a woman. Woman emoji, pizza emoji. Whereas other sequences of emoji collectively represent concepts without regard for linear order, such as the emoji in this expression for Christmas. They could be reversed. You could have Santa first, you could have the tree last, and it would still mean Christmas. Now, an interesting example that I came across shows a popular concept to refer to sexual intercourse that's made with two hand gestures, apparently grammaticalizing as an adjective in the expression fucking crazy. So these contravene a number of the claims that were presented earlier. For example, Cohn saying emoji do not allow building of units from parts. Users can't create novel signs. Gown and McCulloch, emoji meanings are global and synthetic rather than analytic, and emoji are non-combinatoric. So we see a lot of exceptions already to those claims. I'm particularly interested in emoji sequences and their behavior like verbal utterances. And for the purposes of the research that I've been doing on emoji sequences, we defined them as uninterrupted strings of two or more semantically different emoji. So we would include the sequences in the first row, but we would exclude the sequences in the second row. In the second row, we see there's three identical emojis, excluded those. There's two semantically similar emoji with the hard eyes and the hard eyes with the tongue out. And we exclude cases where there are only two emoji and one of them is a skin tone indicator. As in that last example, that's supposed to render as a single image, but on some people's devices, they see it broken down in two images. So we didn't include those as emoji sequences. Emoji sequences are also known in the literature as emoji phrases, emoji sentences, emoji narratives, and other terms. And studies have found that they can convey speech acts and express rhetorical relations with respect to text that they accompany. The question of the order of emoji in sequences has also attracted some attention, although not really any systematic study. But there are four distinct views that can be identified. And it's really unfortunate that the visuals aren't rendering properly, but I'll just explain to you what they are. The first view is that there is no consistent or meaningful order in emoji sequences. And this view was put forward by McCulloch and Gown, who studied a very large corpus of emoji and found that the most common sequences were the same emoji repeated or similar emoji repeated multiple times for emphasis. The second view put forward by DC is that the order is what he calls iconic conceptual. That is to say that all of the emoji together represent a single concept. And so what the missing one here was supposed to be a champagne glass or a party popper, I don't remember which. Anyway, it's indicating a birthday greeting. The idea being that the order of the elements could be switched up and it would still mean the same thing. Denesi also allows, though, that there are a number of emoji sequences that seem to follow the basic subject-verb-object order of English. And this view is put forward more explicitly by Tyler Schnoebelen, who talked about there being a kind of a stance first or a subject first rule. And this is the woman heart pizza example again. And this order is the same as the order in English, of course. Whereas more recently, Jingji and I have observed in sequences in Chinese language context that the stance or grammatical subject tends to appear last, as in the example over there, which means I love spicy food, literally rice, chili pepper, hard eyes. And so the order there is object before verb. And if this pattern is supported with further evidence, it would be evidence against Cohn's claim that in emoji sequences, linear order follows the agent action pattern, which is supposedly cognitively based and universal. So this could be a very interesting case to explore. So I start with the premise that an emoji sequence is analogous to a sentence-like utterance, functions in some respects like a sequence of words, and exhibits specific constituent orders, which I will refer to as word orders for convenience. And it follows, therefore, that we can use word order analysis as a method to analyze emoji sequences. Word order analysis is based on the notion that languages tend to have a preferred or a basic word order, by which they mean the order of subject, object, and verb in a declarative transitive clause that is also pragmatically neutral. Nothing is particularly being emphasized. And there are 6 possible permutations of these subject, object, and verb that are represented in the table here with the example of they eat pizza. And you can see different languages that have each of these orders. Mandarin Chinese, like English, is subject, verb, object. The last 2 orders, just the last 2, OVS and OSV, are very rare. For example, OVS order is only attested in 0.7%, less than 1% of the languages of the world. So if patterned regularities in ordering are found in emoji sequences, it would be evidence that emoji have syntax. This is my point of departure. Now, I should also add that just because a language has a basic order, it doesn't mean that all clauses will follow that order. There are exceptions. For example, in Russian, case marking on the noun indicates subject and object. So all 6 possible orders produce grammatical sentences. Yet Russian still has a basic word order of subject, verb, object. Other orders give special emphasis to one constituent or the other. In languages that lack case marking, word orders vary for pragmatic reasons, such as in the Chinese topicalization. So we see an example here, literally this book I read, translated freely as for this book, I read it or I read it. And what this does is it changes the order, subject, verb, object order of Chinese to an OSV order. Even in most free word order Australian languages, there are a number of them, have a basic SOV order. And thus it follows that an emoji order need not be 100% consistent in order to be considered basic. So let's get to the study that I did, I want to talk about today. It's about word order in emoji sequences on Sina Weibo. And I did this work with Jingji, who was in anthropology at UC Berkeley. And she's shown here holding the poop emoji. Sina Weibo, if you're not familiar with it, is often called the Chinese Twitter, the largest Chinese microblogging platform. And here on the right, you can see that it has some platform-specific emoji. There's more than this, but this is just a sample. And what's helpful is that it provides descriptive labels for each of them. It was greatly helpful when we were doing our translating of the sequences. But iPhone users who are posting on the Weibo platform can also post Unicode emoji from their phones. So we'll find sequences that have both Unicode and Weibo emoji in them. The methods that we used were, first of all, to collect data from top celebrities and their comments. We collected 300 emoji sequences, 150 with text and 150 standalone emoji-only sequences. These were posted between April and late May 2017. Because the meanings of emoji sequences are often opaque, we followed a rigorous three-step process in translating them. First, we translated ourselves, those that we could, and because my co-author is Chinese, she was able to provide cultural insights. And then there was a certain number that we're sure about. We had those translated through a Chinese crowdsourcing platform, the Chinese equivalent of Amazon Mechanical Turk. And after that process, they agreed with each other over 80% of the time. But then there were, I think, 7 sequences that they weren't really sure about. And at that point, we asked 3 emoji experts that were recommended by a Chinese graphicon company, and they were able to agree themselves on those last 7. And so we basically got pretty good agreement on all of these translations. The method that we followed was structural analysis of the sequences, emoji sequences, in their discourse context. We looked at word orders, specifically focusing on subject, verb, and object. And of course, in order to identify subjects, verbs, and objects, we also had to identify what parts of speech the emoji, individual emoji, were functioning as. So we actually categorized all individual emojis for parts of speech using traditional categories of noun, adjective, adverb, and so forth. I had 2 research questions. First, do emoji sequences on Sino Weibo display recurrent word order patterns? And if so, what are they? And second, what parts of speech occur most often in the sequence? So let's start with the parts of speech. There were 685 unique emoji in the sequences. And of these, about 90%, just under 90%, were nouns or verbs. And nouns and verbs were pretty much equally divided, 45.6% and 44.1%. Only 5.5% were adjectives and adverbs, and most of those were adjectives. There's a reason why there were so few adverbs that we'll touch upon later. And then I also would point out an interesting pattern. There were 21 instances where the emoji was functioning as punctuation, and this is consistent with observations that have been made, especially for emoticons, but also emoji, that they are conventionalizing as punctuation marks when they appear at the ends of utterances, single emoji. So we found that also in the sequences. Now let's look at the word order findings. So on average, the sequences were 3.6 emoji long. We were able to analyze over 83% of them using the word order typology. And the most common order of the 6 basic word orders was object, verb, subject, with just about 60%, under 60%. And that included, OV and VS and OVS. And I should just mention that not all of the sequences had subject, object, and verb. Some of them were intransitive clauses, which lacked an object, and others expressed, well, the objects as subjects were implicit, consistent with Chinese being a pro-drop language, which doesn't always express subjects and objects. So that's why we see not so many instances of all 3 constituents appearing together. So OVS together was 60%. The next most frequent order, SOV, was only about half that, 31.6%. And interestingly, there were no instances of SOV order itself with all three constituents. And then lagging behind that was SVO order with only 22.6%. So OVS order really predominated. So let's look at some examples of OVS order. Unfortunately, these emoji are rendering, thank goodness. So in the first example at the top, we see three GIFs and hard eyes with the tongue out. We translated this as GIFs, love I, meaning I love GIFs, with object-verb order. The second example follows a textual utterance. Text says name, a person's name, don't cry. They are your sister-like friends. They will forever love you. The emoji sequence sort of repeats this sentiment saying love they, where they refers to the sister-like friends. So that shows a verb subject order. The third example is an emoji only order that appeared after one of the celebrities posted that people should send gifts to poor children in the mountains on New Year's. And so this commenter responded, love, send fast I'm sending my love right away. This illustrates object verb subject order. We have another example on the bottom. The text says, thanks, dear all the way for your all the way support. And then the emoji are you all, thank I. Again, OVS order. Now we see that some of these examples illustrate an interesting contrast between the word order in the text and the word order in the emoji sequences. So here it's all kind of jumbled together, but I think we can still read it. In the first example, sister-like friends will love you. Oh yeah, the V is supposed to be under love. Your sister-like friends will love you, SVO versus love they, VS. The one on the bottom we saw already, thanks dear all for your support. VO order, thank all versus OVS order in the emoji sequence. And there's a third example there in the middle that I added that's similar where it's dear all, just tell me what gift you want to get from the lottery is the free translation. Dear all, a lottery want, get what gift, just tell me. So SOV indirect object, but SV order compared to VS order in the emoji sequence, which says tell you, meaning you all tell me. So these are interesting examples because they allow us to compare text with emoji sequences where the meaning is essentially the same. And we can see that even though there's no particular constituent that's being foregrounded in these examples, they all seem relatively pragmatically neutral, that the order is consistently VS or OVS for the sequences. Another thing we can see is that the position after the verb, the final position, seems to be specializing for the grammatical subject. So the first two examples show the first person plural. The first is toast, toast, toast. We heartily toast you is what they're saying there. Approve, we approve. Notice there's two different emoji that are used for groups of people. There you have first person plural. We saw already the example of third person plural with the sister-like friends, love you, love they. We saw the example of you tell me what lottery gift you want. That's the second person plural. And of course, the first person singular example, I thank you all thank I. So it shows that post-verbal position specializes for subjects and also not just for first person singular, which is the most common subject, but also for plurals and for different persons. So it shows number and person. We broke down the noun into subcategories, and this chart shows that although the majority of nouns were common nouns, 35.3% were coded as functioning as pronouns. And of those, first person pronouns were 68.2%, and most of those were first person singular. So this is these pronouns are interesting because there are no pronoun emoji. But in Weibo, there are certain icons and certain types of icons that seem to be specializing in this function. So we see, unfortunately, these are all now out of order. Some examples here. So the top two examples, I love spicy food and I love the gift. The first example shows you that the pronoun is integrated into the verb. Basically, the heart eyes here is saying I love. The second example, I love the gift, we see just a face separately standing in for I, gift, love, I. The next pattern is, and a very common pattern it is in Weibo, is using an animal head to represent the self, first person singular. And we see this in the example, lol, I hug the balance award. That's a type of award that a celebrity received. I send love quickly, which we saw before. And down at the bottom, if you can see there towards the middle, thank I thank you. These dogs, particularly the two dogs, the one with the looking sideways and then the other one with its head tilted, are very, very popular as first person pronouns. The other cartoon character in I Send Love Quickly is also pretty popular. And in fact, these patterns are so strong that the subject is post-verbal and that these particular icons are used to express the first person singular, that when we encounter a sequence like the one to the left, where we have a head, a heart, and a head, we know that this means I love you rather than you love me. That is to say, it has object, verb, subject, word order, and the subject is the animal at the end. And then the last strategy is using gender symbols. And this works for both men and women. So we have an example, lol, I got a haircut, with a man saying it. And then a woman saying, I thank you all. The last example is interesting. You can compare it with the other thanking example. They use the same verb of thanking, but different an emoji to represent the first person singular. So while there's a lot of variation here, there's also patterns that are emerging. Of course, there were other word orders. Only 60% fell into the OVS pattern. One that we see not too uncommonly is SVO, as illustrated here. In the first example, the text says, in our heart, you are the winner. And then the emoji sequence is, we love China, with a heart at the end functioning as a punctuation indicator that also indicates affective tone for the utterance. And then the example on the bottom is something that we coded as iconic conceptual, following Denacy's categorization. And it means something like, you and your children, we cheer you on, we're rooting for you, we applaud you, become happy, happy, happy. So you and your children, we cheer you on, become very happy. And finally, another finding that we were not looking for, but that emerged from our data, regarded the use of emoji repetition. Now, we excluded sequences of only repeated emoji, but sometimes they occurred within sequences that we included in our data. And we found that they also were expressing grammatical functions. So for example, we had an example where 3 music notes was used to mean concert. Noun plurals, quite common. Gifts, for example, here. This is not referring to 3 gifts specifically, but just some plural number of gifts. Adjective intensification, so there's an emoji that means great. And then when you use it together, it means very great or awesome. Verb intensification, as we just saw with the pointing fingers, definitely become, and manner verbs where there's this is the reason why I think that there were relatively few adverbs that were included, emoji functioning as adverbs, because so many of the verb emoji incorporate a manner. So this one is hands, giving hands, and it means something like give abundantly or give generously. So putting it all together, what do we have? Well, to summarize, emoji and sequences on Sino Weibo exhibit grammatical properties. They allow building of units from parts. For example, N plus microphone is used to mean a singer. They can function as tense and aspect markers. Back, as we observed it being used to refer to past time, soon to future time. They can express grammatical categories such as plurality and manner, verbal manner, as we saw with gifts and give abundantly. They can be used as punctuation to express mood, sentential mood, and tone, as in the We Love China heart example. And there even are a few examples that I've seen that I think display hierarchical relations. For example, adjectival modification. In the I love spicy food example, spicy modifies, the chili pepper modifies the rice rather than the love. And there are other couple of intriguing examples like this that suggest that some hierarchical relations might be starting to be expressed. But especially, emoji sequences on Sino Weibo have a preferred constituent order, and that order is object, verb, subject. And even though this is a very rare order, less than 1% of the languages of the world, I believe the evidence for it in these data is strong. First, the majority of sentences are consistent with an OVS order, which is about twice as much as any other basic order. Then OVS is used when emoji sequences translate SVO textual utterances, which gives us a really important clue about their being basic. Also, there in those utterances, the OVS is used in neutral utterances in which no constituent is emphasized. And finally, first, second, and third person subjects all appear in final position, indicating that final position is syntacticizing as the subject position. So what kind of a language are emoji? If emoji is a language, they're certainly very different from verbal language in a number of ways. And I would argue that they're similar to pigeons in the sense that they're context dependent. They commonly deal with the here and now, you and I, reference grounded in the current speech situation. And because of those two features, that it makes them difficult to understand if you're not in that conversation with that context. They also share linguistic features, including short clauses with a near one-to-one verb to noun ratio, an absence of grammatical morphology, use of repetition to serve grammatical functions, and a relative absence of complex hierarchic subordinate clauses, as well as a number of other features. And so I think then emoji are consistent with what Givon calls a pre-grammar, or what I'm going to call a pre-language, like pigeons and child language. I want to talk about just a minute about what a pre-language is. What I'm calling a pre-language is a language that involves pre-grammatical processing in Givon's terms. Givon distinguishes two modes of human communication, an older pre-grammatical mode and its diachronic derivative grammatical syntactic mode. And these are what's shown in the compared in the chart here side by side. And if we look at emoji sequences in relation to these characteristics, we can see starting from the bottom of the chart that there is in emoji sequences a paucity of grammatical morphology, one-to-one noun to verb ratio in text, as we discovered, and loose clause chaining. Although I think there's a couple of examples I could show you that suggest that we're moving towards some kind of hierarchical subordination. And if there's time, I have a slide maybe I can show you about that. Whereas So those are characteristics, anyway, of the pre-grammatical processing. But also, we are seeing evidence that falls under the syntactic or grammaticalized column here. Subject-predicate constructions, or I should say predicate-subject constructions, and a grammatical word order, not a rigid order, but a preferred word order. And I'd like to add then to what Gavin says. In 1985, he said the process of syntacticization is found in the transition from Pidgin to Creole, from child to adult. And there is no reason to assume that the same transition did not occur in language evolution. I'd like to propose that would include in the transition from emoji to language. So I concluded, I started off as a skeptic. I was interviewed in Wired magazine in 2017, I think, and they asked me, is emoji a language? And I said, being a good linguist, I said, well, it has these kind of characteristics and it sort of, expresses these things, but it doesn't have X, Y, and Z, all these things that a language has to have. I'm a convert. After working on the Sina Weibo data, I have become convinced that emoji sequences on Sina Weibo manifest characteristics of an emerging language. Not only do they have pre-grammatical characteristics a la Gavin in the table that we just saw, but there is also a preferred word order pattern and syntacticizing predicate-subject constructions that are emerging and that are evident in our analysis. Now that said, Sina Weibo emoji sequences are not a universal emoji language, even though many people claim this. Emoji language should be universal because it's just pictures and everybody understands pictures the same way, right? Well, actually, from a semantic point of view, that's not true either. There's been a number of studies that show that people understand emoji differently in different cultures. But the word order pattern is not universal either, because this OVS order that we found here is rather particular. It might even be unique to the Sina Weibo platform, for all we know. It's certainly different from the order that's been reported in previous literature by Danesi and Snobelin and others. Or is it? So I went online recently and tried to collect some examples of English sequences, emoji sequences that were actually produced by people in the process of communication and not just as a quiz or to be, because there's a number of emoji quizzes out there now. Can you figure out what they're saying? So I pulled up these examples, and at the top half, we have examples that support the pattern that's been reported earlier, that English sequences favor the subject-verb-object order. For example, I love money, eyeballs, I heart cash. To the right, we have a sequence means something like I love painting, or maybe I love art and pizza, with an emoji as punctuation at the end indicating the mood or tone of the utterance. And below then we have the soon speak, I'll be able to speak soon, I'll soon speak. So even though that order of soon before the verb is not necessarily directly in English order, it's subject-verb order. So all of these examples illustrate subject-verb and some with objects, but then there are exceptions, interesting ones that I found below. A couple of exceptions. First is on the top left there, fish rice face with the tongue sticking out, looking satisfied as if it just had a meal. This is something that was produced in an experiment when two people were trying to communicate only in emoji. So it was a natural production, I guess. And I would translate this as I enjoyed fish and rice, like maybe I had fish and rice for dinner. I enjoyed fish and rice, which looks an awful lot like the Chinese example of I love spicy food. In both examples, the object comes before the predicate, which is in the emoji face. Another example that's even more clear, I see dead people, where we have the skulls representing dead people, the eyes representing C, and then the emoji representing the subject, we could interpret it that way as OVS, or we could say that the I's are just IC, that's the verb as well. It's still OV, with the last emoji being a punctuation or an attitude marker. But either way, it's OV. And so I'm not convinced that emoji sequences in English always follow the order SVO. I think there's a lot of cases that are calqued, where people are simply taking an English sentence and choosing emojis to match each word. I think if we saw more instances where people were using emoji to communicate each other in a naturalistic way, that I think we would see more different word orders, and I wouldn't be surprised to see that this OV order is something that's found in English as well. Obviously, there's a lot more research that's needed in this area. This is just a new area, and this study is only exploratory. What about the future of emoji? I see two possible scenarios. One possibility is that emoji will be superseded by newer graphicons in the way that emoji themselves superseded ASCII emoticons before them. There's always new, great things coming out. Now there's stickers and other things. Who knows what we'll have? Maybe holographic icons in the future, three-dimensional icons. The other possibility is that emoji will continue to evolve into an actual language. And in order to do that, they'll need to be able to meet a number of the criteria that were laid out by the linguists that I quoted at the beginning of this talk. They'll need to be able to express complex concepts interpretably. They'll need to be context independent. To support grammaticality judgment, that is to say, to have standards such that it wouldn't be acceptable to switch around the order of emoji. We have couple of examples that we've seen where my co-author says, well, you can't switch the order of those emoji because it would mean something different. That's the kind of thing we'd be looking for. And of course, allow users to create new emoji. Now, I should mention that it is possible to create emoji on some platforms. It's not possible on Unicode. The Unicode emoji have to go through a process of approval. But if users could freely create new emoji and use them in their communications, that would be a criterion. And then finally, would we want to say that in order to be a real language, emoji would have to be acquired by children as a first language? And so you may say, well, that's ridiculous because we can't speak in emoji, and first language as child's first language is of spoken language. Well, of course, that's not always true because some children learn sign language first, but we don't have any cases yet, really, of children learning a written language as their first language. But children really are the future. They're the future of emoji users and smartphone users. And in the meantime, pre-literate children are using emoji. Children as young as 3 years old are posting like the one at the bottom of the slide, which actually was created by a 3-year-old on his mother's smartphone. And Gretchen McCulloch interprets these strings like digital babbling, she said. The nonsense strings that get us used to how our bodies work and how to take turns in a conversation. So a type of pre-discourse. Or an alternative possibility is that as children use emoji, they will impose structure on them and make it more language-like in the way that children transformed into a Creole, and in the way that they could potentially transform emoji as a pre-language to an actual language. Thank you very much for your attention. And unfortunately, you can't see my emoji here. I would be more than happy to answer any questions.